It's interesting to see you both together. Your two lectures are one after the other, not only because the best Belgian architects go to construct the presidential palace in Ankara, but also because the plea Asu you had in the end for a role of the architect as a mediator, on the one hand, maybe I should sit with you, and on the other hand, the way Benoît, you were describing both the role of the contrat de quartier, the neighborhood contracts, as a way to deal with fragile areas where you saw the opportunity. Maybe that's the first part to start, because I as a moderator, I see there a kind of link between your two pieces. Do you, first Benoît, the role of a mediator in your practice, is it, let's say, is it the first type of action, in fact, that you're involved with? Or is that something you don't recognize?
I recognize it clearly, but I don't know from which function I have to talk. No, I mean, I was an actor of those changes in the year 2000, no? So I had the feeling that so architecture was mostly in charge of the big offices and so on. There was some public architecture emerging, and I had the feeling with others that we had to reinvent the practice. No, let's say we had to reinvent the practice, because the practice was not didn't suit to the actuality of the city. No, so one way to reinvent was to be involved, for instance, in those contrats de quartier, which were generation programs launched by public authorities, for which there was no good practice. So we had the feeling that we could reinvent something by developing good practices involving population. So with Olivier Bastin, Lescaut, with others, and Plus, we've developed a practice of participation, let's say. So our practice, the traditional practice of architecture to build, was put on the side in the year 2000.
Maybe one thing, and to add something before I pass the microphone to you, another thing you see is that the Ottoman style references you, the kind of culture building via the city and a new identity for a country. It was also really a kind of project linked to the creation of the Brussels capital region, at least in your point of view. This second turn, as you called it, the deuxième tournant, is a way to actually reinvent what a modern urban project could be, you could say, which is something you were also after, between modernization in the image of the global city, combined with Ottoman style, let's say, revival. There's here a kind of search for a new place for, let's say, contemporary or modern architecture, which gives a new quality to the city. Maybe to the first reaction, mediator role, fragile neighborhoods via contract, the neighborhood contract. Do you see this opportunity?
Well, maybe you should say a bit more about these neighborhood projects. What are they about? Because in our case, we are launching neighborhood development projects like the one I mentioned, 100,000 people, semi-legal ownership structure, very low quality housing. So how is this big neighborhood going to be transformed? So in this transformation process, the normal routine way of doing it is the municipality goes and hires, you said, who is in charge of these informations? Well, it's actually architects, urban planners. They commission an architectural firm to do a master plan of this neighborhood. So it's all, the information is untransparent, unparticipative, the whole process is unparticipative, and the public, well, also, you know, what is the nature of the public in this design process? That, you know, what are you designing and who for? And what is the aim, you know, in terms of the public mission? So all these things are, in a way, technical information, untransparent. So what I was saying is that it is up to someone to mediate this process of opening the information and making information which is lodged in different technical departments to come together. So who does that? This was my question. Who is going to do it?
But if you look at, and I pass the microphone again, if you look at Brussels, which is a city where, a bit like Turkey, and I'm a bit provoking, but in a way it's the same in cities as Ghent and other places where private interests are to a certain extent facilitated in order to stimulate urban development, or big public projects such as the European Quarter projects are in fact following private logics to a certain extent. The neighborhood contract is not a rule, but it's an exception. It's where you start from another point of view, from the public interest is, let's say, put central. Do you see this really in opposition? Do you see other examples where this public interest can start being, let's say, the core of the project? Is that also the second turn?
Yes, a complicated question, Joachim. So maybe a small explanation about my vision of the public, the neighborhood contract. I think you can never forget that there have been created. It's the first tool that was created by the region. So it's a political tool that would, let's say, clearly develop the vision of the region. How should urban development be according to the region? And the vision of the region was, let's say, defined in opposition to the region of the federal state. So how it was before and how it is now. Before, it was a lot of demolition inside the urban core, without any information, only taking into account the interest of the private developers and so on. So the contrat quartier at the beginning had to be defined as something that was in opposition to this. So it was a public project that would respect the urban tissue and the people already living in the neighborhood. So the first article of the contrat quartier, of the law, is it's a renovation of a neighborhood, but according to the existing qualities of the neighborhood. So the idea is to enhance those qualities, not to transform radically. So that was the point. That's the starting point of the contrat quartier. And then also, if during the time before the region, the urban development project had been developed without participation, consultation, and so on, the contrat quartier developed a lot of participation. So a lot of people, actors are involved. It's the municipality, so Brussels is divided into districts, let's say. It's a district who is in charge, and the district, let's say, defends the public, or the public interest, let's say, of the population and so on. So it has something that is totally different from the situation, from like understood from Istanbul. No, but also something that is interesting and that there might be some similarity with Istanbul. I don't know. It's this. There is now this constant confrontation between the districts and the city. And the districts, they say they want, so the municipality, they want to defend the inhabitants, they take care of the local, the global, the social cohesion and so on. And the bad one is now the region. The bad one, who is always against the inhabitants, it's the region. So, in fact, the actors have only changed. The confrontation between the local and the global still exists today.
Maybe the last question to make the bridge to the next session. You've described in your second term, but also the projects you have shown are really, let's say, in Brussels, they are projects that are rather at a small scale. It's public spaces, it's individual projects. The bigger scale, let's say, the metropolitan development or even the regional development has become also in recent years a design question, you could say. In Istanbul, it's clearly a political project, which is more difficult to read maybe in Brussels, that's one. But in Istanbul, it's not yet a design question. Do you see there a kind of new step, or how would you look at this?
Yes, I think between the 1990 and say 2005, before the second term, there was a kind of geographical division of the project. No? the region was taking, municipalities taking care of the poor areas, but they left to the private developer some parts of the city, like the European neighborhoods. It was a jungle in the far west. They could do what they want in those neighborhoods, but not in the poor, let's say. Voilà. So this geography has changed progressively, and public authorities, Brussels, they want to be more and more involved in developing also big urban projects. But since now, I mean, urban projects takes time to be developed also. So this volunteer to change the practice has appeared, let's say, five years ago. And so there is no result to be seen until now. But I think, yeah, in the future, things are changing in terms also of governance. That's a term that we haven't used until now, but governance of the city is very important. I think the situation of architecture has changed in Brussels also, because there has been a political change in 2005, so progressive parties have come to power. And this has changed a lot also for architects, no? Because the progressive parties, they have also seen architecture as a way or as a tool to promote their policy.
If you say, that's the last question, if you say we actually should start with the place, you described in fact one place where the government, the central authority, executive authority cannot simply overrule individual interests, because these individuals are 100,000 in neighborhoods that are fragile. How would you describe your hope to start from there, if you see some of the examples and in kind of evolution in governance structure? The contrat de quartier is in fact a governance invention, you could say. It's a way to contractualize a participatory process with a budget linked to it that can be invested in programs decided with local residents. How would you look at this? Do you see potentials for this governance swap or evolution, or is it still very hard to imagine?
Well, I want to know about this contract quartier, who actually was behind this, the running with it, and making sure that it was implemented in the end. Because what we find happening in Istanbul is that, of course, the rent pressures are so high that the expectations of, or the examples of possibilities of rent extraction are so visible that everybody is motivated. Citizens are also motivated by A, that their semi-legal position is going to be legalized, and B, that they will have a deed which is going to be a commercial asset making a lot of money. So you are fighting against actually private interests increasingly being formulated on a commercial basis versus common interest. Who protects, who articulates this notion of common interest? This is the problem in Istanbul. This is the difficulty. And this is what we saw in Gezi Park. Gezi Park was actually the public space where we had to think about our public image. You know, the way Gezi Park is going to develop will say something about us as Istanbul citizens. You know, so that's why it was so crucial that we were there to show ourselves that we are here, that beyond our private interests as public figures, citizens, we are here thinking about our public common good. But then what happened to Gezi Park? At the moment it's totally full of holes, metaphorically and literally, right? And there is no, there doesn't seem to be an emerging kind of concentration of energy, which is again going to pull people to function as citizens. So I'm talking about citizenship, the difficulty of being citizens in Istanbul.
Thank you both. What is interesting maybe is to see that in Brussels the changing culture producing space for architecture, but also architecture helping to produce space for architecture and urban quality and citizenship, it has started not from the kind of construction of the European capital or the global city, the financial capital, let's say, but from the most fragile neighborhoods. So that's where I found an interesting link between your hypothesis that in fact maybe another culture of urban development could be constructed from the most fragile parts of the city rather than participating in this global star architectural festival.
I think that's a part of my message. I would say that in Brussels everything has started with a small social housing building built by Pierre Mondel in Molenbeek, 4 apartments, but the first building which had shown the opportunity, let's say, for architects to create a nice lived environment for people. It's a very small building in Molenbeek. There is a book by Maurizio Cohen, he's a critics, Belgian, Italian critics but living in Belgium. He said that that's celui par qui tout a commencé. The building that was started. So the whole reflection of an evolution of architecture in Brussels has started with those very small projects, but very, very small. Not the huge big ones by a UN studio, I don't know. No, they are not interesting, I think.
Thank you. We will continue this debate during the day. We move on